You can spend half your life trying to be kind to everyone, saving other people's souls, guessing their moods before they even open their mouth, but a strange weariness will still linger inside, as if you're constantly proving your worth to someone. And for a long time, an empath doesn't realize that most often they're not talking to the world. They're still talking to their inner father. Many empaths grow up with the feeling that love must be earned, through understanding, through comfort, through silence, through patience. And that's precisely why they become dangerously sensitive to other people's coldness. One glance can ruin their evening. One dry message triggers the anxiety they call intuition. But Jung once said that what hurts us most is often not connected to the present moment, but to the shadow of the past. And an empath carries that shadow very deeply. Sometimes the father was harsh, sometimes distant, sometimes he was physically present, but emotionally like a closed door. And then the child within the empath began to learn to read the slightest changes in the voice, energy, and mood of adults. This is not just how sensitivity is born. This is how an internal danger scanner is born. The empath thinks this is their gift. But part of this gift arose from the need to survive emotionally. The strangest thing begins later, when the adult empath suddenly notices that they are constantly drawn to people they need to love more fully. Cold, detached, incomprehensible, as if their psyche is leading them again and again to the same door, the very one they couldn't open as a child. And a painful hope arises within. If this person finally chooses me, then I am worthy of love after all. But this isn't love seeking closure. This is an old wound seeking closure. The empath remains angry with their father for a long time, sometimes consciously, sometimes secretly, through irritation at men, through mistrust of strength, through fear of being like him. But the stronger this internal war, the weaker the empath becomes, because his own energy is splitting within him. One part wants softness, another strength. One wants to feel, another to defend himself. And the person begins to live as if without an internal backbone. The real turning point happens quietly, not in loud conversations, not after psychological quotes, but when the empath one day realizes a terrible thing. His father was also wounded. Perhaps he, too, never heard words of support. Perhaps he was taught to survive, not to feel. And in that moment, something changes inside. Not because the pain disappears, but because the eternal struggle with the past disappears. Jung wrote that a person doesn't become bright by imagining light. They become whole by recognizing their darkness. And the empath suddenly notices. It's not just the wounded child living within them. Within them is also their father's strength. The very same strength they previously rejected. The ability to say no. The ability to walk away from destructive people. The ability to not dissolve in other people's emotions. And it is at that moment that sensitivity ceases to be a curse. After internal reconciliation with their father, the empath becomes frighteningly calm. People begin to sense something new in them. It's harder to provoke them. It's harder to make them justify themselves. They no longer try to explain everything to everyone, because the hunger for validation disappears within. And a person without internal hunger is a completely different energy. The most mystical thing about this is that even the empath's perspective changes. They stop seeing the world through the eyes of a child seeking warmth, and begin to see through the eyes of an adult soul, which itself has become a source of warmth. That's when intuition becomes clear, without anxiety, without panic, without the constant expectation of betrayal. And for the first time in a long time, the empath feels not emotional noise, but inner silence. But almost no one warns the empath about the final stage. After reconciliation with their father, many people begin to disappear from their life. Those who fed on their guilt, those who loved their insecurity, those who needed a convenient savior. And at first, it's frightening. It seems as if the world has become empty. But later, the empath realizes, this isn't loneliness. It's making space for genuine connections. And this is where the empath's true strength is born. Not in hypersensitivity, not in the ability to read people, but in the ability to no longer lose oneself around them. Because a person who has made peace with their inner father stops seeking permission to live. They finally begin to live as if their soul is no longer on its knees. After this reconciliation, the empath suddenly begins to notice something strange. They no longer fear others' disappointment. Previously, any dissatisfaction with another person felt like a threat. It was as if someone important were turning away again. Love was leaving the room again, and they needed to urgently fix themselves again. But when the voice of the unloved child ceases to resonate within, other people's emotions no longer control their soul. And this state is at first even frightening, because the empath has always considered anxiety to be their nature. The hardest thing for an empath is to admit that for many years they confused love with emotional tension. Calm people seemed boring, approachable people uninteresting, but cold, unpredictable, and complex people evoked an almost mystical attraction, because the psyche was searching for the familiar atmosphere of childhood, the very one where love had to be discerned between silence and distance. And only after internal reconciliation with their father does the empath begin to feel the difference between passion and a nervous system that lives in anxiety. Sometimes reconciliation comes not through talking with the father, but through deep awareness. It comes at a time when the empath suddenly stops expecting an apology. This is one of the most painful stages, because hope still lingers within. One day, the father will understand, admit his mistakes, and say the right words. But the maturation of the soul begins when a person stops making their healing dependent on someone else's awakening. Jung said that everything we are unaware of within ourselves comes into our lives as fate. And the empath suddenly notices. While he was holding a grudge against his father, he unconsciously created people around himself who repeated the same emotional distance. It was as if the world was showing him the same scene over and over again with different faces, until he saw the source. After reconciling with the internal image of his father, the empath's attitude toward his own strength changes. Previously, strength seemed harsh, dangerous, almost cruel. So he chose gentleness even when he needed to protect himself. But gradually, a new understanding comes. True strength does not destroy sensitivity. She protects her, like strong walls around a temple. That's why many empaths become very quiet after inner healing. They no longer try to prove their depth. They don't argue with those who don't understand them. They don't rush to save every wounded person. Because for the first time, they begin to feel the line between compassion and self-destruction. And this is a line that most people never find in their entire lives. There's another thing that almost no one talks about. When an empath reconciles with their inner father, their perception of men changes in general. Hidden tension disappears. The unconscious expectation of danger or coldness disappears. And then they begin to see people not through an old wound, but through reality. Without constant internal defense, without the desire to either earn love or leave first. Sometimes, after such an inner shift, an empath begins to remember their childhood completely differently. Those moments that previously seemed only painful reveal themselves more deeply. They begin to see not only their own pain, but also the atmosphere of the times, the fears of their parents, the silent weariness of adults who themselves have been lost. And this isn't an excuse for the past. It's a way out of emotional blindness, where there's only one guilty and one wounded. The most mystical thing begins later. The empath suddenly notices that they no longer feel the constant need to be a convenient light for others. They can be tired. They can be silent. They can refuse, and yet not feel guilty. For many people, this is a normal state. But for the empath, it's almost a spiritual revolution. Because previously, their value depended on how much others needed them. And one day, a very quiet, almost sacred realization dawns. The father within no longer appears as a judge. His image no longer hangs over the soul like a cold shadow. And then, for the first time, the empath feels not like a little person seeking permission to love, but like an adult soul that has become its own inner home. It is from this moment that true strength begins. Not ostentatious, not aggressive, and that rare force next to which other people suddenly feel calm. There are wounds that don't scream. They simply turn a person into a perpetual observer of other people's moods. And an empath often doesn't even notice how their entire life begins to revolve around one question. Am I good enough now to not be rejected? This question can live quietly, almost unnoticed. But it is precisely this question that causes the soul to tire most. After internal reconciliation with their father, an empath feels for the first time how much energy was previously spent on an unconscious struggle, on internal arguments, on mentally replaying the past, on fantasizing about how things could have been. And when this war ends, a strange feeling of emptiness appears, as if it has suddenly become too quiet inside. Many empaths are afraid of this silence because they are used to living in emotional noise. But it is precisely in this silence that a new personality is born. No longer one that survives through sensitivity, but one that begins to choose themselves without a sense of betrayal. And for an empath, this is one of the most difficult transitions, because previously self-care seemed selfish. He was taught to feel others before himself, and now it's as if his psyche is learning to breathe again. Sometimes an empath thinks his main problem is that his heart is too deep. But the truth is different. His problem was that he lived for too long without an inner support. When the father within is perceived as cold, judgmental, or absent, a person begins to seek support in other people's emotions, in love, in recognition, in being needed, and then any loss feels like the end of the world. After reconciliation, something even changes in the body. The constant tension in the chest disappears. The anxious anticipation of conflict disappears. The empath no longer scans the space every second, trying to predict the mood of those around him. And only then does he realize how exhausted his nervous system was. He called it intuition, but much of this intuition was the fear of feeling emotional loneliness again. Jung wrote that a person meets himself many times under different masks. And the empath begins to see how long he has been wearing the mask of the savior. A mask of understanding. A mask of someone who can endure anything. But behind this role often lurked a child who simply wanted to finally be noticed without the need to be perfect. There's a deeply painful moment in this inner journey. The empath begins to realize that some people didn't love the real them, but their willingness to endure. And this discovery is initially heartbreaking, because it comes to the realization that many relationships were based not on love, but on an old wound that feared abandonment. After internal reconciliation with their father, the empath stops fearing their own firmness. Previously, any no evoked an almost physical feeling of guilt. It seemed that refusal would ruin the relationship, cause coldness, and make them a bad person. But now a new energy emerges within. Very calm. Very mature. It no longer demands that their boundaries be explained. The most surprising thing is that the empath begins to experience loneliness differently. Before, silence seemed like a punishment. It awakened old fears of being unwanted. But now solitude becomes a place of restoration, a space where the soul hears itself again. And that's when the empath stops clinging to people simply because they fear emptiness. Sometimes it seems as if after reconciliation with their father, the world begins to test the empath even more intensely. Old people return, old triggers, old scenarios, but now the same hunger is gone, and the person is surprised to notice that they are able to look upon manipulation calmly, without the desire to save, without the desire to earn love through sacrifice. And at some point, the empath understands the most important thing. Their strength never lay in the ability to feel the pain of others. Their true strength was born when they stopped betraying their own pain for the sake of others' comfort. Because inner reconciliation with their father isn't about the past. It's the moment when the soul finally allows itself to become an adult and no longer live with an outstretched heart. There's a moment that comes to an empath unexpectedly. Without warning, they look at themselves in the mirror or simply walk down the street, and suddenly realize they no longer feel that eternal inner pursuit. Before, the soul was constantly trying to catch up with someone. Someone's acceptance, someone's warmth, someone's approval. But now an unfamiliar state arises within. I no longer need to earn the right to be myself. And this is where true freedom begins. After inner reconciliation with their father, the empath stops confusing love with suffering. This is an almost mystical shift in consciousness. Previously, they were drawn to places where they needed to endure, wait, understand, pull someone out of the darkness. He thought this was what deep connection looked like. But then a painful realization dawns. Love shouldn't constantly wound the nervous system. True intimacy doesn't force the soul to live in emotional survival mode. Jung wrote that until a person makes the unconscious conscious, it will rule their life and he will call it fate. And the empath suddenly sees the whole chain. How he'd been choosing similar people for years. How he'd tried again and again to receive love where it had to be earned. How he'd been afraid to be strong because strength was associated with his father's coldness. And it's this realization that breaks the old family curse within him. The most important thing happens next. The empath no longer wants to take revenge on the past with his success, his usefulness, or his self-sacrifice. He stops living with an inner cry, "Look, I'm worthy of love." And in this silence, a new energy is born. Very rare, very calm. This is the energy of a person who is no longer at war with themselves. And then something appears that was never there before. Inner resilience. Not a mask of strength. Not cold indifference. But a deep sense of support within one's own soul. The empath still senses people. Still senses the mood of space. But now the pain of others doesn't completely overwhelm him. Because someone has finally appeared within who protects him from within. His own inner father has become not a source of fear, but a source of support. And perhaps this is what truly defines an empath's maturation. Not losing sensitivity, not becoming hard, not closing your heart, but learning to be both soft and strong. Stop facing the world like a child begging for love. And one day, feeling a quiet, almost sacred thing, your soul no longer seeks a home in other people. Because after inner reconciliation with your father, it has finally become a home for itself. What do you think? Can inner reconciliation with your father truly change an empath's destiny? Share in the comments what resonated with you most. I'd be very interested to read your thoughts. And if such profound topics help you better understand yourself, subscribe to the channel. Here we talk about what is usually hidden deep within the soul.